previous section, I demonstrated not only how to defend against your opponent's single leg takedowns, but also use his awkward positioning to counter with a takedown of your own. Although all these techniques are highly effective, they won't always be possible, especially when up against a wrestler who is familiar with single leg counters. However, when your opponent establishes the single leg position, it is also possible to counter with a submission. Submissions are illegal in wrestling competition, and they will often catch your opponent off guard. The goal is to apply the submission before your opponent has a chance to complete the takedown. When you accomplish this, one of two things will happen. Either your opponent will immediately submit, or he will put all of his focus into defending against the submission, which requires him to abandon his single leg takedown. In this sequence, I demonstrate how to catch your opponent in a guillotine choke when he shoots in for an outside single from opposite fighting stances. I begin by placing my hands on my opponent's head and forcing it to the outside of my body. Once accomplished, I wrap my left arm over my opponent's head and then hook my forearm across his throat. At the same time, I slide my right hand across the opposite side of his neck and clasp my hands together. To apply the guillotine choke, I stand up tall and drive my arms upwards into his neck. Although the majority of the pressure is applied to your opponent's trachea, which cuts off his air supply, when you apply enough pressure, it also pinches off his carotid arteries and severs blood flow to his brain. Body positioning is very important to make this choke work. Notice how I don't lean my shoulders backwards. A lot of fighters will do this in an attempt to get another few inches of pressure, but this only gives your opponent an opportunity to pop his head out of your armpit and escape. Instead, you want to keep your shoulders forward and finish the choke with your hands. Ideally, you want the bony part of your wrist to be dug into your opponent's trachea. If you position your forearm into his trachea instead, there will be too much cushion, making it difficult to finish the submission. In this sequence, my opponent and I are in opposite fighting stances, and he shoots in for an outside single. Just as before, I place my left hand on his head, but instead of using that hand to push his head to the outside of my body, I use it to drive his head straight back and create separation between our bodies. This allows me to place the outside of my right arm against his left shoulder, hook my right biceps around the left side of his head, and wrap my right forearm around the right side of his head. Notice how this positions the crook of my right arm in the center of his neck. Next, I rotate my body in a clockwise direction so that I can grab my left biceps with my right hand. Once accomplished, I bend my left arm so that my left hand is over his left shoulder. This gives me a basic rear naked choke grip. Just as when applying the rear naked choke, I finish the submission by pinching my elbows together and squeezing my arms. As my arms drive into his carotid arteries, blood flow to his brain is severed and he taps out. This technique is often called the executioner choke, and there is a reason. It's very powerful. However, the instant you apply it, your opponent will most likely release your leg and begin fighting your hands to break the choke. Even if he manages to break your grip, you still manage to escape the single leg takedown. In this sequence, my opponent and I are in opposite fighting stances, and he shoots in for an outside single. However, immediately after closing the distance, he realizes that my rear leg is within reach and reaches for it with his rear arm in an attempt to transition into a double leg. To begin my defense, I place my hands on his head and move it towards the outside of my body, just as I would when defending against a regular single leg. Once accomplished, I grab my opponent's right wrist with my left hand to break his grip on my rear leg. A split second later, I hook my right arm underneath his right arm and then grab my left wrist with my right hand. This provides me with a Kimura lock and gives me complete control of my opponent's right arm. To use my control to score a takedown, I jerk his right arm upward, breaking his grip on my rear leg. At the same time, I rotate my body in a clockwise direction. As my opponent's arm folds behind his back, it puts a tremendous amount of pressure on his shoulder, forcing him to roll his upper body forward to relieve the pain. Continuing to crank on his arm, he eventually does a front roll and lands on his back. Rather than let my Kimura lock go when my opponent lands on his back, I maintain my grips to prevent him from scrambling. Once I'm hovering over him with my lock intact, I have a couple of options. I can drop down and finish the Kimura submission, drop down on top of him and obtain side control, or back away standing. In this sequence, my opponent and I are in opposite fighting stances, and he drops low and shoots in for an outside single. Immediately, I place my hands on his head and drive it downward. This is an excellent defense because where the head goes, the body follows. With his head being pushed towards the mat, it makes it very difficult for him to elevate his hips and finish the takedown. Next, I move his head to the outside of my body. At the same time, I create separation between our bodies by taking a backward step with my rear leg. Once accomplished, I step my left leg in a counterclockwise direction so that my weight is directly over my opponent's back. This allows me to reach my left arm underneath his left arm and grab my right instep, trapping his head between my left arm and right leg. Due to this trap, as I execute a forward roll over my left shoulder, my opponent comes with me. As I pull my opponent on top of me, I already have the triangle position. My right leg is wrapped around the right side of his head. By gripping my right instep with my left hand, I have trapped his left arm to the left side of his neck. To finish the triangle submission, I hook the crook of my left leg over my right foot, pinch my knees together, and squeeze my legs. It's not the easiest technique to execute, but if you manage to pull it off successfully, it will be on your highlight reel forever. In this sequence, my opponent and I are in opposite fighting stances, and he shoots in for an outside single. Just as with the previous technique, I immediately place my hands on his head and drive it downward to prevent him from elevating his hips and completing the takedown. Once his head is positioned down by my lead knee, I remove my rear hand from his head and post it on the mat. Balancing all of my weight on my lead leg and left hand, I elevate my rear leg off the mat and shoot it behind my opponent's lead leg. Notice how I rocket my body forward as I do this so I can trap the back of my opponent's lead leg with my left hip. Still applying downward pressure to my opponent's head using my right hand, I corkscrew my body toward my back. This drives my right leg into my opponent's hips, causing him to fall backwards over my left leg. Unable to regain his balance by stepping backward, he crashes down to his back. Although I too am on my back, my opponent's lead leg is trapped between my legs, allowing me to quickly lock in a knee bar. To apply the submission, I wrap my left arm around the back of his Achilles tendon and then wrap my right arm over my left arm. This arm positioning allows me to pull his leg into my chest. It also allows me to position the toes of his foot against the side of my face, which will hinder him from rolling out of the submission. To apply the knee bar, I bridge my hips and hyperextend his leg.